Good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm learning how to be a little more comfortable talking to the void on these things. That's exciting. Last week, I gave a crash course on the hero's journey on Winter is Writing, and then earlier this week, I followed that up with a blog post that kind of gave a brief summary of the hero's journey, but then went on to talk about why the hero's journey is an excellent way to build a character-driven story, whereas 3-act structure can easily be more plot-based and characters can fall flat or feel passive if you don't also think about developing strong, interesting characters when you're building your plots. So that article is linked up in the description for this post. And this entire month for April, I plan on focusing on character because people seem to be really interested in that. And also next week on Thursday, I believe the 11th, Rosie Thor is going to be back, and we're going to be talking about character and specifically the Princess Bride and probably some other examples. But so like my own homework is I'm going to go rewatch the Princess Bride this weekend, and I suggest everyone do that, especially if you haven't seen it. You're missing out. And if you have seen it, it's an excuse to watch it again. Princess Bride is an excellent film for so many reasons. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. But tonight, I thought it would be interesting to start exploring what happens from a writer's perspective if your idea starts with like a world or a plot or a character, because what comes first determines what questions you ask to build a full story. So let's take Indiana Jones first. So if we start with our idea, if our inspiration download from the ether was the character Indiana Jones, and you didn't have a world and you didn't have a plot, where would you go next? And the first thing you always ask is why? Like, why do you want to tell a story about this character or this world or the story itself? Like, what is the point? And a really simple example is like, is there a moral that you're trying to get across, or is there a belief as a writer that you're trying to share with the world? That kind of stuff. Or are you just trying to make people laugh, entertain them, that kind of thing? So like, taking into account your why for creating a story or a world or a character is super important. So like when I'm writing for Rose City Swing, the first thing that I'm really trying to manage is entertaining everyone who attends Rose City Swing, and also giving the staff something that, yes, is hard work, but they're actually really enjoying. And I believe that's one of the reasons why Swinging in the Rain was so incredible, is because I built a story that the staff members wanted to go above and beyond for. So that was really exciting. So if we backtrack to Indiana Jones, who is an archaeologist professor, adventurer, who really loves and respects history and wants it to be treated well. So like his thing is making sure that artifacts end up in a museum instead of on the black market, kind of a situation, right? But otherwise he doesn't necessarily believe in the paranormal or in God or that kind of stuff. And that's where we find him at the beginning of the first film, Lost Ark. And the point of that story is for Indiana Jones to get to the point where he can believe something more in God. And that's how he is able to tell Marion and himself to keep their eyes closed when the Ark gets open at the very end of that film. Because if he had maintained his atheism through that story and not been changed to be open to something more, he would have had his face melted off with everybody else. Grand old time. So if we back up a bit to the beginning and we just have Indiana Jones, the character, and we don't have a story yet, We probably maybe have the world, because that is very much a part of who Indiana Jones is the 1930s archaeologist, because I know Spielberg and George Lucas loved B movies from the 1930s, and that's kind of what they were paying homage to in Indiana Jones. For those of you who don't know, like, George Lucas helped write the Indiana Jones films. So anyways, back to just the character. So you want, if you have a character, to build a world and a story that will challenge that character, because the best stories, in my opinion, are stories where a character is forced to confront something deep inside themselves and either overcome it or change. And character arcs really mean change. It's really simple. Like, a character who has a full arc comes out the other end of the story a different person than they started. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a better person or a stronger person. They can be a worse person too. That's where we're getting into the realm of tragedy or that kind of stuff, or the fall from grace. So, like, if you think of Star Wars episodes 1 through 6, Anakin starts with a hero's journey and then a fall from grace, and then he's the villain, and then that arc changes. And almost like, if you were to map it out visually, it's like he has a sine wave. He goes up and then he crashes, but then he comes back up again when Luke helps redeem him at the end of Return of the Jedi. Anyways, so character arcs are all about change. So when you have a character, you have an idea for that character, you need to think about what change you want them to go through. And you need to build a world and a story that will help facilitate that change. And that often means obstacles. So, like, for instance, if you were to take Indiana Jones and completely remove the Nazis from those early films, like, I don't know, it would just be Indy in the desert digging stuff up. Kind of cool. But without that conflict, the story would fall flat. And also, without the paranormal element, the stories wouldn't be quite as interesting. So you're picking and choosing the elements that you add to a story based on what the character needs to have an arc. So I hope that makes sense. Now, I'm going to see if I'm referring to my list. I wrote a list of a few movies and a TV show to think of other examples. So, Zootopia. So, like, 180 from Indiana Jones. I love the movie Zootopia. And that is a story with two main characters, Judy Hopps, the rabbit police officer, and Nick, who, man, I forget his last name, the fox. And they both have really compelling character arcs that run parallel to each other and are often in conflict with one another, but then they both resolve together. So Judy's is, she just wants to be the first rabbit police officer, right? And then she falls into this world where there's propaganda and, like, behind the scenes racist propaganda against predators. That is a complete lie, and it's being managed from behind the scenes to make the masses believe something that isn't true about predators going, what was the word? Going, like, primal or something like that. It was awful. And so Judy's character arc was about not only becoming a good police officer and doing that, but it was about confronting her own inherent biases against predators. And the fact that she had to partner up with a predator, Nick, the fox, really created a lot of conflict there. And so when it got resolved and she figured out how to change and overcome that to become a better person, that was a huge deal. And then you've got Nick over here on the other side, who is all about himself and is very selfish at the beginning of the story. And he learns to actually accept and care about another person. And it's not really about him opening up to the wider world. It's much personal, that he opens up to Judy and is willing to accept another person in his life that supports him, and that's like a huge deal for him. And so when it gets to the point where Judy's biases against predators becomes obvious and she almost uses her like pepper spray on him, like, oh, that moment in the movie, if you've seen it, you don't know what I'm talking about, just rips your heart open, because it shows that while she has achieved all of this success as a police officer, the part that like really matters, the relationship, like it's still broken because she has those biases. And he had finally opened up to trusting her, and she proved that he couldn't trust her yet or anymore. And then their relationship completely falls apart. And it's about them both overcoming the hurdles to come back together and to improve each other. That is like what makes Zootopia so incredible. It's those character arcs, and they are possible because of the world and the story that facilitates them. So I hope that makes sense. So that's like some stuff about character arcs. You want to make your choices about the plot and the world that go with the character to challenge them and to actually put them up a tree and throw rocks at them. That's how I was taught about conflict originally when I was a kid learning how to write. It's like you send your main character up a tree, like they're trapped there, they're hiding, and then you throw rocks at them. You make it even worse. And you know you've done your job right as a writer if you're able to facilitate a dark night of the soul moment that you yourself as a writer don't know how to get the character out of that situation, because that's where you end up having to be really creative to get them out. It's if you like give a really tough moment for your character but you have an easy out for them. As a writer, that means I haven't done my job. I really need to make it super hard on the character. And that takes me to my next point. Sometimes the idea for a character comes, and the way you understand them actually ends up being their mid character arc or at the end of their character arc. So sometimes you get a character that's fully formed in your head, but they're post character arc. So you actually have to devolve them to a point where they need to change to create their character arc, right? So it's like, that's why superhero origin stories are so great, because it automatically has an arc built into them. They start normal, and then they're bitten by a radioactive spider, and they have to deal with the change that comes from that and how to incorporate that into who they are and to grow to be able to handle the powers, great power, great responsibility, yada, yada, yada. And that's one of the reasons why superhero sequels are harder to write, because you don't have that inherent change built into them. And I feel like that's why origin stories tend to get redone. So like, how many Spider-Men have we had in the past 15 years? It's insane. So there's that. You sometimes have to devolve your character in order to give them the appropriate character arc. So that's that. And then another thing that you need to think about when you're building a character is how to make them interesting. So there are lots of different ways to make someone interesting, and they don't necessarily have to be likable. So being interesting and being likable are two different things. So if you take Sherlock Holmes, for instance, and I'm using the BBC Sherlock Holmes played by Benedict Cumberbatch as an example. As a human being, he's a horrible human being. He treats people like shit, but he's so smart and quirky and broken in some areas that he's incredibly fascinating, because you're like, well, I know how I would react to the situation that he's in, but because I have no idea really like what his headspace is, like how is he going to react? And then over time you start to learn and understand how he reacts to things, and then you anticipate what he's going to do, and you get really excited. It's like, oh, this person just offered him tea or something. This is going to get super awkward because it's Sherlock, and he's so unique and quirky, weird. And side note, this is where you can start having like odd reactions to the same actor playing a different character. Like, I loved Doctor Strange, but seeing Benedict Cumberbatch play Doctor Strange is still weird to me because I still so strongly associate him with the character Sherlock Holmes. So anyways, yeah. So the ways you make characters interesting is by playing with different qualities, not necessarily the likableness. So like, how competent are they in certain areas? Like with Sherlock, he's a genius of deduction and is like a walking Wikipedia, which is a little terrifying. But he is really incompetent with social skills. So it's kind of like this contrast between what he's super competent in and what he's really incompetent in. And that creates a really unique and interesting character. You can also think about, let's see, I have a list that I'm referring to. So like cool abilities, right? So superheroes, that is automatically interesting when someone can leap across buildings. And then their relationships with other people, like if they have strong relationships or conflicting relationships, those are interesting to see. Another scale to think about is how proactive they are. And that's actually what I talked about in my blog post earlier this week. I talked about having a proactive character is really important, that their choices and their actions are what are propelling the story forward, as opposed to being reactive and the external circumstances of the world forcing the character to take action. So if we take Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope again, which I mentioned in the article, if you compare Luke with Han Solo, Luke is very passive in Act 1, but as soon as his aunt and uncle are killed, he takes action. He goes with Obi-Wan. And then as soon as they're captured by the Death Star and Obi-Wan goes off to turn off the tractor beam, and R2 finds out Princess Leia is on the ship, Luke takes initiative in that moment to go rescue Princess Leia. And he actually has to convince Han Solo to help him. And it takes a lot of convincing to get Han Solo to help him. And then Han Solo convinces Chewie to go along with the crazy plan. And that initiative on Luke's part is what makes him the main character and the hero. Whereas Han's passivity is what makes him a supporting character. Interestingly enough, by the end of that film, Han ultimately makes the decision to come back and help destroy the Death Star. And that's the moment where his character starts into his own version of Act 2 of the long arc for Han Solo. And he starts actually taking action and being proactive in this whole world. So proactivity is super important. And actually, it's so important that it makes writing stories about certain types of characters really hard. So like in my novel, my main character suffers from pretty bad depression. And one of the symptoms of depression is inactivity, just sitting around doing nothing. And that's incredibly boring to read about. So one of the things that I have to work into the story is this balance of showing, yes, she has this depression and also inner turmoil and all these really intense, awful mental health experiences. But I need to have a character that a story that moves forward, that she drives forward. So it's like, how can I balance that and give her something to do and a way to be proactive that doesn't take away from really showing her depression as a character, right? So that's, I chose a very advanced character for the first novel that I've written, yay. So there's that. Let's see. Another thing that's really interesting, I'm going to use John Wick, the first film, as an example. Now, spoilers. I should have said spoilers at the beginning of this whole shenanigans anyways, but like, if you have not seen John Wick, spoilers. The beginning of that film is about Keanu Reeves' character, John Wick, and his wife has died of cancer, and from beyond the grave has sent him a puppy, cutest puppy ever. And from the trailers, we realize he's a hardened assassin and that kind of thing. So we're like, when are things going to happen? And then uh, he's assaulted in his home, and these people not only try to kill him, but he survives, but they did kill his puppy. And that's not okay. Now imagine if the film had started after that point. If you didn't have any of that backstory and it was just Keanu Reeves checking into the assassin hotel, ready to kill some people. Sure, it would be probably like fun to watch because it's Keanu Reeves and it's an action film. It'd be like, meh, but we wouldn't care. So another element to take into account when building characters, and then the way you present them to an audience in the story, is you want to make sure that the audience cares. I think I talked about this on a previous episode where like this is one of my main problems with like large disaster films, and there are so many people, and it's like, yes, on the one level, like mass tragedy from a huge disaster like that is terrible, but it's not going to get me here until I have a strong emotional, empathic tie to one or more of the characters. So this can be like, if you think of it really simply, if your main character is an asshole, but if you have them save a cat from a tree at the beginning so you can see that they're a little bit human, you're like, okay, there's something that might be redeemable about this asshole. I'm going to care more. Whereas if they like shot the cat in the tree, I wouldn't watch that movie. So there are lots and lots of things to take into account when you're creating a character, like the context of the world that they're in and the story that you're wanting to write, and making sure that the world and the story and your character's starting point are all designed to facilitate a full character arc where the character changes. And the change doesn't have to be good, it doesn't have to be bad, it's just that it needs to be change. So, for example, the Pixar film Brave. My biggest problem with that film was I didn't think Princess Merida was actually the hero of that story. I thought her mother was, because her mother had a full character arc. She came around to understand her daughter in a completely different way, whereas Princess Merida was kind of Princess Merida the whole time. And I found that boring. And I'm like, if the screen time had been focused on the mother more and really delved into that character arc more, I thought it would have been a much more interesting and more engaging story. But that's just me. So I'm going to start wrapping up. So for those of you who are here live, if you have any questions on anything that I have been talking about so far, please pop them in the comments. Otherwise, I'm going to start wrapping up and call it a night. So we've been talking about character. I plan on talking about character all month, both here in my Facebook Lives and on my blog. And next Thursday, Rosie Thor is going to be back, and we're going to have another conversation, this time on character specifically. And I know we're going to be talking about the film The Princess Bride. So everybody's homework is to go and watch that between now and next Thursday. And we'll talk about other things too, but I'm super curious to hear her thoughts on Inigo Montoya, because she teased something the last time she was on with me, and I'm super curious to hear what she has to say. So cool. I highly recommend checking out the blog post I wrote, which is linked up in the post for this live. Otherwise, I'm going to call it a night. Thank you for swinging by, and I'll share the replay later. So have a good night, everyone. Bye.